Well, hey guys, how's it going? This is another episode of Correcting Misinformation. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the third episode. I started with a theist, I did someone who was an atheist, and now I'm moving back to a theist again. I take turns every time just to sort of be fair and try my best to be objective. It's impossible to be fully objective in these situations, but I try my best anyway. For those of you who don't know, I'm a doctoral student at the University of Southern Mississippi in the field of educational research. And so, due to my background in research, I do these critiques with research level questions and conflicts between religion and atheism, because the goal is to get the best conversations from both sides, and the best way to do that is basically to look at science and look at research. I noticed that both sides are sort of flawed in their research methodology, and so I'm just doing what I know to my field, and trying to do the best I can do with critiquing both sides in a very fair manner. So here we go. Before I even start, I'm going to go ahead and let people know that this Christian is not quite as bright as the last person I critiqued, which was an atheist. This is one of those things that gets on my nerves with some Christians, even though I am a Christian as well, is that they don't even try to understand certain scientific things. And it really gets on your nerves because they don't even read, some of them. And when you can pick up that they're not telling the truth, it becomes really sad because that diminishes the religion itself. So here we go. Let's go ahead and
I've been getting a lot of science deniers commenting on my videos saying, "Where are your credentials? What study have you posted?" Actually, I have a bachelor's in test tube studies, and I have a PhD in astrobiology. Do you even know what that is? I didn't think so. I wrote my thesis on how soy is going to save us. Just like, this is my favorite scientist, is Bill Nye. I got a Bill Nye Funko Pop, because he debunks fascist pseudoscience, and like, we're starting to learn stuff about the universe, and like, there could be a multiverse, which means like anything is possible. That reminds me of my other Funko Pops. I got my America Chavez. I love her because she has like two mommies, because everything's possible in the multiverse. And you know, even when I'm at home alone, I wear not one but two masks because I trust it that much. I bet you don't have that much faith in science. And I got 6 vaccines. I'm getting my 7th tomorrow. You jealous? I bet you bigots haven't even got your 5th vaccine. My brain is so big, my fedora doesn't even fit over it. Look at that. And if I wasn't a real scientist, how exactly would I have this? Look at this. These are real test tubes. Look at this, because I do actual studies, and I actually trust in the science so much. Everything that we need, meaning, purpose, morality, ethics, it's in this, okay? You want to see how much I trust it? Watch this. Look, this is my concoction. I'm making a look at that. And also, I don't only have test tubes, I have beakers. Do you even know what this is? Most, if not the vast majority of published research claims are false. This is a very well-known study in the field of meta-science. We need to ask the meta-level questions.
We start off in this, and I guess he's trying to be funny. I don't find it funny at all, and I would probably say most people wouldn't find it funny either. Talking about the meaning of life coming from a test tube. Newsflash, there is such thing as behavioral science. And this isn't me trying to be mean. It's just one of those things, and this is something that I can credit against both sides. Some people, for some reason, don't look at the behavioral science as much of a scientific field as biology, when the work is pretty hard as well. So he's talking about you can't derive meaning from without religion. And even though I'm Christian, I would say that that's not necessarily the case. I'm not going to make that kind of case right now. I more want to talk about his citation that he doesn't even read. And I can tell he doesn't read it, or at the very least, he read it and he's lying about it. It's one of the two. And I don't want to accuse anyone of not telling the truth. But he mentions that most research findings are false. Now, before I go into this article, I want to mention that if you read Campbell and Stanley's quasi-experimental and experimental research, it's a book that was made all the way back in the 60s. It even mentions that most research findings are going to be disappointing. And let me explain what that means. It's very unlikely for you to find a phenomenon in nature or wherever it is, and I'm sorry, my dog's barking a little. It's very difficult for you to find that phenomenon in nature, create a hypothesis, and then end up creating a research study where you find something that has statistical significance that goes along with that hypothesis. Most research studies, this is going to go back to his article now, are found false, but not for the reason that he states. Now, reading this article, it does mention possible bias that could come about. And those biases could be different companies or certain things. Now, any good researcher knows that there are limitations within research. And when you look at those limitations, if there may be a certain company that's trying to do that something, it may not be best to even... It may not be best if they have a certain goal that they're trying to reach through it. And most people who know research know this pretty well. Now, I'm going to come back to that claim in a second. Now, part of the reason why research studies are mostly false is for the reason I outlined a little bit a moment ago. And it's actually mentioned in the article. This is part of the thing that's sort of frustrating. You see that it mentions it's difficult to find a phenomenon in nature where you create a hypothesis and you find it statistically significant, and then replicating it. Part of how good science is done, now this is how I'm going to go back to my point before. Talking about different companies. Part of how something becomes an established part of science is if you can replicate it time and time and time again. That's how you get reliability. And that's part of how you get validity as well. Because something can't be valid without it being reliable. So you want this thing to be replicated over and over again in different settings to see if it is valid. So that is the reason why research studies are, quote unquote, most of the time false. It's not because of what he's saying. It's because most of the time, when you're trying to figure something out, you're going to get it wrong. That's part of how research works. And Campbell and Stanley puts it pretty well that more than likely, if you go in, you're trying to do something, you're going to be disappointed. But it is the only way forward. The only way forward is to continue doing research, continuing to view things, phenomenon in nature or a certain setting, and continue to experiment on it. And to, of course, find statistical significance. And a lot of people may not know what it is. I'm not going to go into too much detail. It has to do with the p-value. When you do a statistical test, part of how you know whether it's done by a reputable source has to do with the type of... If you're examining certain items, you have a statistical test. And a lot of this you might see in inferential statistics or even descriptive statistics. But inferential statistics is where you're looking at hypothesis testing. The null hypothesis is your baseline hypothesis where you don't think anything will happen. It is the baseline, it's going to be the same. Versus statistically significant, there's going to be a significant item based on the statistical test where it'll have a p-value of less than 0.05. Now, it gets more complex than that, but I don't want to go into too much detail for people who may not understand or quite get it, and people who may not wish to understand. But here we are. This guy lied about this one source right off the bat, or he just doesn't understand it or didn't read it.
To ask the pre-scientific questions that are assumed prior to doing the scientific endeavor. This self-awareness is so important, especially in science, because we want to actually get to the truth. And the problem is with the cult of scientism, that is completely thrown out the door. We don't think that science has been institutionalized and money and big business has got intertwined with the scientific endeavor, because science is not as objective as we think it is. All throughout human history, power structures have discredited any narrative, any science that does not fit their narrative. And this time is no different. It really is pseudoscience. It really comes down to a question of authority. Because who gets to fact check the fact checkers? What are the facts? Are the facts just brute facts? Is there just a scene, or is there a scene as, interpreted within a paradigm? We are not as objective and unbiased as we think, even the most objective scientists. Establishment mouthpieces like Sam Harris, who will use his free will to argue against free will. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who will say, don't do philosophy. Bill Nye, who literally only has an engineering degree, yet he's somehow allowed to talk about literally every single scientific field, and he's changed his position multiple times. They are the scientism high priests. They are the mediators between us and the lab coat Mount Olympus, where they just have all the facts, they have all the pure research, and we need these people, the scientism high priests, to translate the scientism gospel to us. Earth is not flat. Vaccines work. We've been to the moon. Climate change is real. The universe is expanding. Evolution is a fact. Dude, we're all made of stardust. Stand up for science. They're dogmas that you're not allowed to question. You know, they're two most important: the secular miracle of the Big Bang and Darwinian macroevolution. And they have
now, I'm not really going to go into this evolution versus creation sort of thing. I do think evolution is a pretty valid theory, even though I am Christian. I have a biblical answer for that as well, which I've mentioned in a past video. But, you know, I'm obviously open to hearing anything, but evolution is a pretty established part of science. Now, I'm not going to go into that because, again, my main goal is for people to walk away as Christians. For the most part, as a Christian. Now, as a part of this series, I'm more trying to talk about good research. And he mentioned something that he has a point on, and he really dropped it. And what he meant by, he was talking about fact checkers, who gets to fact check the fact checkers. And I'm not a big fan of there being fact checkers on online platforms. I feel like it's up to the person to actually believe or actually look up, because the thing is it doesn't really change much. At least I wouldn't think, and I haven't seen a study on this, but does it really change the people's minds? Most of the time, at least people I know, I found it hasn't. So part of how, and this is part of where he's wrong about not doing research or not understanding research, or saying that the majority of it's wrong. Well, part of how they control for bias is you go through a thing called the IRB. Now, this is going outside of what he's talking about with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye. I don't think you should take every scientist's word on something. And the reason I make that is you need to look at what the majority of scientific peer-reviewed research has done. Different scientists can have conflicting things. I remember a paper I did a while back, a review of the literature project. I came to a different conclusion than someone else on a similar topic, but we both had plenty of sources to back up what we were talking about, and neither of us were looking for one thing in particular. but there was plenty of science to go both ways. So that's why I'm not a big proponent of you following like pop scientists, and those people for the most part do have some pretty good credentials, but part of how you talk about good science and checking the fact checkers is if something is done through peer-reviewed research is pretty reliable. And how I mean by that is they do have factors which control bias. One of the examples is going through the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board at a certain college. Now, what happens with that is when you do research, it is made up of different members that critique you, that look at the world through a different lens than you do. And so when you go through that process at the university, anything that even remotely seems like it could be biased, they are not going to let it done. And part of this thing was made all the way back to ensure that researchers have rights of certain things. Well, not researchers, but participants as well. One of those would be the Belmont Report, and talking about the Tuskegee experiments that happened all the way back when, and it's to protect the right of the participants, but it also is to check for bias within the researcher. I remember I had to do a study within survey-related research, and how I worded one question, or how I worded two questions, and I didn't even mean it to be this way, but when I did, it was two questions, and it made it seem like I was trying to push something, even though I wasn't really trying to. And so they'll critique things like that, like, hey, reword this a little bit so it doesn't seem like it's pushing your certain agenda on it. So the people in the IRB are pretty objective for the most part, because it's made up of several different members who even then have a different viewpoint from what you may have or what they have within the group at the college. So understanding that, you should trust what the majority of the peer-reviewed research shows. So what he's talking about is false. You need to look at just where the research lines up. He's not wrong, as in, I wouldn't look at the claim of one or two scientists. Part of how we continue to move forward is we look at the people, what's been replicated over and over again. And part of the thing I dislike about someone making an argument like this is when I can make an argument for Christianity itself, a person like this would dismiss it because I'm making an argument from a research standpoint. And when I do that, he's already dismissing what the vast majority of research would be. So if I make a claim, and my claim would be within the social sciences, dealing with religious topics, whenever I stick up for Christianity, it would be sidelined because of how people like this make arguments. It's not very good. And, I just hope he can change this eventually. It's not going to happen in this video because I've seen this video all the way through. Let's continue with it, though.
Scientism, heaven, we're going to get this Star Trek utopia, and we're going to explore everything, and we're going to know everything, and we're going to live forever. They even have their own salvation. Salvation through science, salvation through transhumanism, through evolving past man, through uploading your conscious to an AI, to becoming a cyborg, whatever it is. They are striving to live forever. None of this is new. Humans are fundamentally religious beings, and they're just making science their religion. But the problem is that the way that they do it, you can come to drastically false conclusions because of the cult of scientism. Static universe, bloodletting, drinking mercury. Bible has a better track record than any of these people in lab coats following the most trendy science. And the Bible is vindicated because it is all about man's spiritual problem, about man's pride and arrogance, our tendency to worship created things and to make idols out of things like science, and thinking that we can have salvation via science. We can have utopia via science. And so this is why humility is so important. The problem is trying to explain everything with science alone and looking down on philosophy and religion. You're missing out on the pre-scientific questions, like the problem of induction, because we do live in an anti-intellectual age where they look down on Christians. And we can see this because they go one step further than they need to. They say, God doesn't exist. They say, Jesus, he didn't even exist. He didn't exist in history. They say, prayer, it doesn't even work. Don't do it. Yet we see miracles every single day. We see hurricanes reverse course. We see Roe versus Wade overturned. Wade, I thought prayer didn't work. Scientism proponents' neurotic nature where they have to constantly correct and say, actually, correlation doesn't equal causation. Something like cigarettes, correlation doesn't equal causation. So you have all these scientists and doctors and dentists saying, oh, cigarettes are great for you. And the scientists and proponents are the ones that delayed us getting off cigarettes as a society. The problem is not.
So he's sort of, I guess I would say, wrong on this topic, and let me explain. I don't know about the AI thing. The thing that I will admit, being a Christian, and a lot of people with religion, there's something that we want to cling on to living, even living past this life. But not everybody shares that same sentiment. There are some people I know who don't believe in God that are perfectly happy passing away in this life and not moving on to something else. There are some people I know who would almost rather that. They feel like that makes this life more meaningful. I don't necessarily agree with it, but to make it seem like people who, and I'm not saying he's saying this, but it's pushed in a way that it makes it seem like people who believe in science believe in all this. Now, let me go into a different claim that he makes within the cigarettes. Now, I don't know how cigarettes got stopped within the medical community, but I do know that that might have been an issue. Now, there are other things he was mentioning, such as like blood stuff. Look, most of this came about before this scientific peer-reviewed research where we learned how to control for certain items very closely came about. Not about the cigarette thing. I'm talking about the thing where he was talking about blood. He was showing a picture. Seemed like a very old thing. And I've seen bad arguments from people like Kent Hovind as well that are saying, well, Washington died because they took all his blood out and they thought that would heal him. And I don't know if it was Washington or what, but I've seen them make some weird argument like this. But that was before scientific testing where you're able to put things in certain perspectives, to use mathematical equations to see if there is a causal factor, a correlation, if there is statistical significance shown. A lot of times you do that through certain statistical tests, along with also using some descriptive statistics as well. And that's just something he doesn't understand. Moving to the cigarette things, I would have been willing to bet that the scientists were the first ones who ended up looking for this to be done with. Just because we don't know something within the scientific world doesn't mean we won't figure it out and then later change it. That's one of the amazing things about science. When we don't understand something, and when we continue to look for the answer, and then we find something that's major, it changes. It's the beauty of science. So that's part of the dilemma that he doesn't understand. If you want good, reliable science, it's got to be replicated over and over again, using inferential statistics and having the stats show you whether there's statistical significance or not. Now, there's ways you could set this up through statistical testing, along with participants and such stuff through peer-reviewed research. But that's something he doesn't get. A lot of this happened before all that even came about. And the doctors with the cigarette thing, I'm guessing that's a picture maybe from the 50s or the 60s. I would assume that was right around the time that these stats things became majorly popular, but I'm not for sure. I'm just talking about the oldest books that I find and that I study are those kind of books that came from the 60s. So if If that is true, and I'm not saying that it is true, I'm not saying I know it all for sure, then that is something major they caught on pretty quick, from what I could tell. But even regardless, it doesn't show anything against science. It just shows that, okay, over time, we look at a phenomenon in nature, we test it through peer-reviewed process with participants, looking at certain statistics to see whether there's statistical significance within an item, in a behavior, or a medical issue, and seeing if there's something with it. And with smoking, it did. So it's not a scientific cult or anything. This has to do with us gaining knowledge as we evolve as a group of people. This happens, and it's going to continue to happen until all of us aren't on Earth. It won't happen even further than that. So he's very wrong in what he's mentioning here. And if you understand it from a research-based perspective, it looks sort of foolish. All right, we're going to continue on with this.
Science. The problem is scientism. Scientism is a paradigm, and that's ultimately what we need to critique is paradigm level questions. Are you in the right paradigm? Are you in a paradigm that can account for what it assumes about the universe? And a lot of these issues, a lot of the errors of scientism would be resolved if these scientism proponents, if everyone just took one philosophy of science class. The thing is, whether you're a Christian or you're a lab coat believer, we are in the same dilemma. There is a fundamental distrust of human reason alone. In the lab coat scientism paradigm, man is just a monkey. So if we just have a monkey brain, and we are just random chance, and it's all about survival, well then necessarily our brain just evolved for survival. It did not evolve for truth. So to worship our reason like it can somehow know everything about the universe, well, we just evolved for survival. Our consciousness only knows impressions. Can it actually ever know what really is the case? So there is a distrust of human reason. And in the Christian paradigm, man is fallen. In our human reason, we cannot depend on the false autonomy of human reason. Reason was affected in the fall. And so the problem is putting reason above everything else. It needs to be a holistic approach. And in both views, there is a distrust of human reason alone. I find it weird that people say, I have faith in science. This is what science says, as if it is some deity, because that's what the scientism proponents do. They make science into an idol. For the video, leave a like and comment if you want me to do more scientism creationist videos. But the problem is not science. The problem is man's fallen nature. We worship created things. We think we're going to achieve salvation. We're going to achieve meaning through science. But science can only explain what is about the universe. It can only give descriptive statements. It can never give normative statements. I mean, like David Hume says, you can never get an ought from an is. Now, science is important, but we also need philosophy. We need philosophy for ethics, for metaphysics, for epistemology, for asking the meta-level questions. All these things that are missed out if you just have a purely atheist, materialist worldview and you don't believe in anything metaphysical. You're not willing to question your paradigm.
So a flaw in what he's talking about that you should... everybody should take a philosophy of science reading, and that he makes a claim in a lot of these videos. That's why I feel comfortable saying this. He says that these people who are atheists don't look at philosophy of science. In this series, I critique certain people about a research-based perspective, and granted, I don't know a lot about philosophy. But I won't say that someone who is a Christian or an atheist, I won't say that as a group they all need to look at this and that they're not well versed in this. I may say one person may not be well versed in this, and I'll point out those people on this channel. Or I might say their research methodology needs improvement. But I'm smart enough to realize that there are going to be people who are researchers that take a different stance as me. And so when I mean someone's research methodology needs improvement, doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong on a topic. That means that they need to improve their research methodology, and most of the experts would probably agree with me on that if they looked at it. Now, talking about this, he shouldn't make this claim because there are plenty of people who are atheists that claim to love philosophy. Matt Dillahunty is one. Now, I don't agree with Matt Dillahunty on a lot of stuff. Me and him disagree pretty readily because, I mean, obviously he's an atheist and I'm a theist. And I'm not going to go much into it in that. He'll eventually be on this channel, by the way. But this is Kyle's day. So, as we move further, he's talking about how people who believe in evolution, or people who are atheists, or like don't have anything dealing with morality simply because of evolution. He's throwing the typical creation argument, as in that it's a man-eat-man world, literally. See, the thing about that is we were given the cognitive ability to be a little bit higher than the other animals. That's how we've gotten as far as we've gotten. And so him talking about morality, what's keeping you from doing this maybe to another person? Well, because I realized that would eventually come back on me. People wouldn't want to be surrounded by me. And part of how we made this big society is looking after one another. And him saying a monkey brain, I'm sorry, monkeys are pretty smart. If you're talking about a different sort of creature. Now, again, I'm not going to get into evolution too much because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. If you have to classify me as anything, it's probably going to be more of a behavioral scientist. So, I do agree religion is very important and that people should look at it, but he's going about it the very wrong way. Him looking at these people that are saying trust in the science. Now, don't get me wrong, I've known people who will say that, but then you can give them peer-reviewed studies that show them something in a different direction, and they take it like you're not telling the truth about it, or that they just disagree with you when you can bring about the peer-reviewed research and they can't. And that is very wrong, too, from those people as well. But, yes, you should trust science because right now, if you follow what has been statistically tested over and over and over again and has been replicated, is pretty safe. Now, don't get me wrong, there's going to be times where we have to do new things. Maybe come out with cures for diseases. And that's, again, something that has to be replicated within people or animals, and then has to be tested over and over again until we see statistical significance. Are you catching the trend here of why research is so important? Is in every facet of life. So when he's talking about this, he's just plain wrong. And so in this paradigm, people really need to look and, yes, trust the science that can be continuously replicated. Now, there is going to be some things that we may think in science that ends up being shown to be wrong. But that'll happen, obviously, later, and that'll be something that is, again, continuously replicated over and over and over again. That's one of the interesting things about science that I mentioned. When they're wrong, they admit it. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to move back to an atheist after this. And so I am not sure who I'm going to do. I may do Matt Dillahunty just for fun. And when I do an atheist, don't think I'm just purposely hitting these atheists on purpose. It is more of critiquing both sides. And right now, even being a Christian, I hate to say, some of these atheists think a little bit more than some of these Christians. And it's pretty harmful for people who are me and can't talk, that have a lot of faith. And it's one of those things that my side really needs to improve on. So here we go. I hope y'all enjoy yourselves. I hope you enjoyed the video. and leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the channel.